And during that entire time that he's been incarcerated, he's continued to say that he didn't do it.
As a manager at the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City, when his boss, Barry Van Trees, was murdered.
They had no choice. At this particular point in time, we have too much coming in from the FBI.
Excluded you, but two other potential suspects, a former Bastrop police officer, Ed Salmella.
Right now, we are still waiting to hear if that execution is going to go through.
It's pretty much a roller coaster. That's pretty much what it is. I mean, you know.
We need to talk to experts who can advise us about the DNA testing that needs to be performed.
And that we feel like today justice has been served for our family.
Number 4, Richard Glossip. Richard Glossip, a former motel manager, is convicted of slaying for ordering the 1997 slaying of his boss, Barry Van Treese. Another employee, then 19-year-old Justin Sneed, admitted to slaying Van Treese with a baseball bat in Oklahoma City. But prosecutors told jurors Sneed did so in a slaying for hire plot masterminded by Glossip. Sneed received a life sentence in exchange for his testimony against Glossip.
And during that entire time that he's been incarcerated, he's continued to say that he didn't do it.
As the jury found, he is truly no danger to anyone.
We have been through more than our share as a family, and we have stood together.
His legal team today tried to convince the board why he shouldn't be put to death.
Everything I've just said about Rich Glossip is undisputed.
Glossip has always maintained his innocence. He has narrowly avoided his demise 3 times, as previous punishment dates ended with reprieves or stays. As of now, he has spent a quarter of a century in prison for the demise of his boss. The international law firm Reed Smith spent more than 3,000 pro bono hours investigating Glossip's case and published a 343-page report commissioned by a bipartisan group of state lawmakers. The independent investigation revealed the state's intentional destruction of evidence before trial and an inadequate police investigation, Reed Smith said. The law firm and Glossip's attorney have since uncovered more evidence, including letters Sneed wrote in prison.
Thank everyone from the Oklahoma Court of Appeals to the first investigators.
But the board did side with the family of the victim, with the family saying they're ready for justice.
And itself should be enough reason for this board to recommend clemency.
And that we feel like today justice has been served for our family.
The letters are part of an amendment to Reed Smith's initial report. He was first convicted of capital slaying and sentenced in 1998, but that was overturned in 2001 because of ineffective defense counsel. He was convicted again in 2004 and again sentenced fatally. That year, Glossip was more than an hour past his time when the governor issued a stay based on the constitutionality of the state's protocols. Glossip's decades on the row have been punctuated by a spate of reprieves and stays. In an interview, Glossip said he's still anxious as each punishment date nears. His lawyers have presented concrete evidence for his defense. At the time of the alleged crime, 33-year-old Glossip worked as the manager at Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City. Glossip had never been in trouble with the law. They said that in the early morning of January 7, 1997, 19-year-old itinerant maintenance person Sneed had a criminal record and raging meth addiction, and he beat Treese fatally with a baseball bat in room 102. Van Treese was also knifed from the front and the back. Cash was stolen from under the front seat of Van Treese's car, and the vehicle was moved a short distance. Sneed was captured and eventually admitted he took Treese's life, at one point describing it as a botched robbery. The most damning evidence is that Sneed's fingerprints and DNA were found all over the crime scene and on the money he stole from Van Treese. There is no forensic evidence tying Glossip to the slaying. In April of 2023, Oklahoma's Attorney General asked for a new trial in the case. It's now up to the Oklahoma Court of Appeals to decide whether to grant or deny the request for a new trial. Glossip is currently scheduled to be punished on May 18, 2023.
As a manager at the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City, when his boss, Barry Van Treese, was murdered.
And on the telephone by 2 guests, Don Knight, one of the pro bono attorneys representing death row prisoner Richard Glossip.
Number 3, Willie Manning. For 21 years, Andro inmate Willie Jerome Manning waited for a DNA test to prove his innocence. In 1994, he was convicted in the slaying of 2 white Mississippi State University students who were kidnapped outside a frat house and later found shot in the head. Manning was a black man facing an all-white Southern jury, and the cards were already stacked against him. The prosecutor's case relied on testimony from a jailhouse snitch and a woman who wanted to see her own criminal charges disappear, and an FBI expert who had a hair sample linked Manning to the scene. Manning was convicted and sentenced fatally, but on May 7, 2013, he got an 11th hour stay of his fatal punishment. The The reprieve came days after the Department of Justice delivered letters calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation's microscopic hair comparison analysis flawed. While there wasn't a positive match, the FBI expert stated or implied that a questioned hair could be associated with a specific individual to the exclusion of all others.
They had no choice. At this particular point in time, we have too much coming in from the FBI.
We need to talk to experts who can advise us about the DNA testing that needs to be performed.
Willie Manning's lawyers say they don't even know for certain how long the stay of execution may last.
Rob Mink, an attorney for Manning, said that the FBI's hair analysis was drilled into jurors during closing arguments. The DA echoed the FBI's claim that the sample likely belonged to a black man. Manning's case is only one among thousands from the 80s and 90s that used the FBI's pseudo-scientific analysis, which may have resulted in fatal sentences or decades-long imprisonment for innocent people. Microscopic hair comparison is not a DNA test. Rather, follicles are put under a microscope and inspected against hair samples of parties involved in a crime. In 2009, the National Academy of Science called it highly unreliable. As early as 1984, the FBI acknowledged that microscopic hair comparison couldn't positively determine whether hair belongs to a certain individual. The admission, however, didn't stop its experts from using it. In 2013, Manning came within hours of being punished, but the Mississippi Supreme Court stayed his punishment after the Justice Department admitted that the FBI's bullet and hair analysis was invalid. After more than 20 years on Mississippi's End Row, Manning was finally exonerated. He was the 153rd person exonerated since 1973 and fourth from Mississippi.
They were kind of forced into a position of, we really need to take a moment, step back and look at this before we proceed any further.
To advise us on the ballistics evidence that has recently come into question.
One thing they do say, if they get the chance, they'll be pushing for a retrial or for the disputed DNA evidence to be re-examined.
2. Thomas Arthur. Thomas Arthur was convicted of the February 1, 1982 slaying of Troy Wicker, a Muscle Shoals barge engineer. Judy Wicker, Troy's wife, testified that she had an affair with Arthur while he was in a work release program. Arthur, with Judy Wicker following, entered the house and shot Troy Wicker while he was sleeping. At the time, Arthur was serving a life sentence for the 1977 slaying of Eloise West, the sister of his common-law wife. Wicker testified that she paid Arthur $10,000 from a $90,000 life insurance policy. Judy Wicker initially told authorities that an assailant who was black broke into the house, shot her husband, and physically exploited her. But phone records and a tip about an inmate with an unusual amount of money on his person led them to Arthur. Arthur, 74, who maintained his innocence from the moment he was first questioned by law enforcement officials, went through a legal odyssey involving no fewer than 3 trials, 7 punishment dates, and multiple challenges to his conviction and the state's fatal penalty process. Arthur's first conviction was overturned by the Alabama Supreme Court in 1985 because prosecutors improperly introduced details of his prior conviction into the record. A second conviction in 1987 was also overturned due to prosecutors introducing a statement Arthur made to police without counsel present. Convicted a third time in 1991, Arthur, as he had at his 1987 trial, requested the jury impose a fatal sentence.
Tonight, the waiting continues for convicted murderer Tommy Arthur. Right now, he sits on death row.
Tommy Arthur has coined a nickname, the Houdini of death row.
The U.S. Supreme Court issued a temporary stay of execution. That is a delay in carrying out.
That's right, Jimmy. You know, I've actually learned a lot this evening waiting with fellow media colleagues.
Arguing that life without parole would tie my hands in the appeals process. The inmate pursued that process through the state and federal courts, with his challenges often sparing him from punishment with hours to spare. A 2001 punishment was put off so the federal courts could hear his challenge based on representation. 2 dates in 2007 were delayed over a challenge to lethal injection before the U.S. Supreme Court. Arthur escaped a 4th date in 2008 after Bobby Ray Gilbert, an inmate, came forward claiming he, and not Arthur, butchered Troy Wicker.
Waiting for his execution. Welcome in. I'm Jim Dunaway. Just before Arthur's scheduled lethal injection,
the Supreme Court justice handed down that stay just 20 minutes before he was scheduled to die by lethal injection. Right now, we are still waiting to hear if that execution is going to go through.
The state courts rejected the claim, saying there was evidence Arthur helped Gilbert prepare an affidavit. Investigators who probed the case in 1982 and an attorney who represented Arthur at his 1987 trial said they never heard the name before the 2008 affidavit, and Judy Wicker said she never knew Gilbert. Arthur's attorneys fought for him, noting the lack of physical evidence at the scene and arguing that more advanced DNA testing on a wig used in the crime might exonerate Arthur. The defense offered to pay for it, but the state refused. In the end, innocent or guilty, Arthur could no longer outrun his punishment and was put down on May 26, 2017. Number 1. Rodney Reed. Rodney Reed was a man with a troubled past, but his story really begins with his arrest in 1996. Reed was accused of exploiting and slaying Stacy Stites, a 19-year-old woman from Texas. The prosecution argued that Reed, who had been in a secret relationship with Stites, took her life in a fit of jealousy when she ended things with him. Reed, however, maintained his innocence throughout his trial and subsequent appeals. The case against Reed was largely circumstantial. The prosecution pointed to DNA evidence found on Stites' body as proof of Reed's guilt. However, Reed's defense team argued that his DNA evidence was inconclusive and that there were several other suspects who had motive to slay Stites.
Being innocent of a case, something like this here, and spending all this time and family and all that factors in, but then
excluded you. But two other potential suspects, a former Bastrop police officer, Ed Salmella.
It's pretty much a roller coaster. That's pretty much what it is. I mean,
What do you think of that?
I honestly think that they used that Hispanic guy as a scapegoat.
Despite the lack of concrete evidence tying Reed to the crime, he was found guilty and sentenced fatally in 1998. The case received national attention, with many people, including celebrities and politicians, calling for a re-examination of the evidence and Reed's sentence. In 2019, the case took a dramatic turn when new evidence came to light that suggested Reed was innocent. A former prison inmate claimed that Stites' fiancé, a police officer named Jimmy Fennell, had confessed to slaying her. Fennell had a history of violence against women and had been convicted of kidnapping and exploiting a woman while on duty as a police officer. Courts halted his impending punishment after calls for further review of his conviction, as the new evidence sparked a wave of support for Reed, with many people calling for his release from prison. Later on, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted Reed an indefinite stay of punishment. His defense team is continuing to fight for a new trial and have his conviction overturned. They're also pushing for DNA testing on evidence of the crime scene that was not tested during the original trial. That's all for today, folks. See you next time.